There, I'm on. It's good to have everybody out this evening. It's good to see if you're live streaming the services tonight. We will be rapidly covering the Ten Commandments tonight, or what I haven't got to yet in the material, which is quite a bit of it. So we're going to move a little fast through some of this. But before we do so, let's go to God in a word of prayer. Our great and heavenly Father, we're so thankful and humbled for this opportunity to come together and to look at your word once again, to examine the laws that in your wisdom you gave to the nation of Israel, that they may display your power and your wisdom and your care for mankind, and that we may glean from them what you would have us to glean, so that we may know that there is a God in heaven who has ruled in all of history, and that who cares for us and gives us laws for our own protection and for our own good, to point us towards Christ, the ultimate fulfillment of this law. And in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. So I'm going to start roughly where I ended last time. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 1, we noted briefly last time, and we'll note again, the power of this word, the power of the Decalogue, which we talked about last time, means the 10 words. That's ultimately what it's called in Hebrew. We call it the Ten Commandments. Their power comes directly from God. God issues these words, and unlike the rest of the law, these words were spoken directly by God in the hearing of all the Israelites. So, and we'll talk, time providing, at the very end about what exactly happened there at the end, and kind of some of the role that Moses ends up playing as mediator of the law in regards to this. But these words come directly from the storm cloud that is gathered in the tremendous scene that we talked about last time on the top of Mount Sinai, and are heard by the Israelites specifically. You'll also recall from last time that I mentioned two of the laws, number 4 and number 5, are prescriptive. They say you should do something. So you should honor the Sabbath, you should honor your mother and father. Those are the laws saying you need to do something. The other 8 are proscriptive, saying you should not do these things. So the other 8 are all prohibitions against certain activities. The first 5, as I mentioned last time, all come with explanatory notes. So there's some kind of additional information that's given as to why we're doing this thing. And you'll notice that in that, those largely deal with the regulations that have to do with man's relationship with God. All right, so most all of those come with some explanatory note that God wanted to pass along to the Israelites of, I'm telling you to do or not do this, and here's why, or here's some additional information as to why we're doing that. The only one of the second 5 is a promise that comes with, and as we see again repeated in the New Testament, that this command, honor your father and mother, comes with a promise so that it may live long with you in the land. And then the other of them, the last 5, have no explanatory notes. Now, I think that's interesting for a number of reasons. One is that it implies a little bit to me a couple different things. One is that there's an argument in apologetics called the moral law, or the moral argument. And that is that all men everywhere are born with an innate sense of what is right and wrong as it relates to how they should treat their fellow man. And so I think it's very interesting that in the Constitution of Israel, that the 5 commandments that we particularly relate to having to do with treating your fellow man, God felt it wasn't necessary to give any additional explanation as to why you shouldn't do those things. It was self-evident. And I think that's very interesting to me in the purveyance of the moral argument for apologetics, that God presupposes that you should know why you shouldn't be doing these things. And also is interesting in the fact, and I've never thought about this till I sat down to study for this. Note that the judges were instituted 2 chapters ago before the law was given. What were they judging, and how did they know how to judge? They knew how to judge because they're people walking around like you and me, and we all have some innate sense about how our fellow man ought to be treated. The revelatory part of all this is how man is to relate to God, but there's an element of all of this that is innate to humans that they ought to know because they're born and made in the image of God, that they ought to respect their fellow man. Now, there's obviously gray areas with that, but nearly everyone agrees that there is some moral sense of right and wrong that underpins humanity, and it exists in the Ten Commandments. So that's an easy lesson in apologetics there, and is a common argument that is thrown out amongst Christian apologists, and you can find it right there in the Ten Commandments, which I think is a pretty powerful piece of information. So in Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 3, we kind of have the preamble, and we have the first command that's given. And I'm going to read it here, and it says, "And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me." All right, so that explains this covenant relationship that God is beginning with the Israelites. All right, so he is coming into a covenant type of relationship with them, and it's frequently called this Hesed relationship. And I have basically summarized it here: loyalty required in response to loyalty shown. So let me explain this. In the ancient Near Eastern people, and particularly with the Semitic people, they believed across the board that if a party had gone out of their way and shown honor, rescued, aided you, it created a moral obligation on your part to show loyalty back to that individual. And that fits with a lot of the values that we see in the Old Testament. We see some of the values that are constantly espoused in the Old Testament are this idea of showing kindness to strangers. What is the word I'm thinking of? Hospitality. I wanted to say hostility, and I was like, this is not hostility. Hospitality. So hospitality, is obviously a value that's greatly apprised in the Old Testament and throughout that portion of the world, even till today. Less so, probably in our world the way it is, but in that world, if you were to show a loyalty, if you were to give aid to a party, it created this lasting moral obligation that you have to not just simply ignore that party, but to show some type of loyalty. And so this is a Hesed relationship. God had rescued them out of the land of Egypt, and therefore they owed him. They had a moral obligation to him. And not just those individuals. The nation itself owed its genesis to God, all right, in a very special kind of way. That's part of the reason why the covenant is binding, not just on the people who were alive then, but is binding on all the future peoples, because that nation wouldn't exist had God not done the actions that he had done. And so therefore those people, as well as all the people that come down the line that would further be called Israelites, owe the fact that they are free, that they are no longer slaves, and that they are in this relationship with this particular God because of the actions that he took in the first half of the book of Exodus. So the command is, you shall have no other gods before me. Now, gods here, this is another one of those important points where we have to get back into the heads of what the Israelites are thinking. The word gods there is the word Elohim. And so why not simply say, I am the only God, believe in me? Or are there no other gods? Well, the reality is in their worldview and in the way that language is used, there were other gods. There are other supernatural beings, and they knew it to be so. There were supernatural beings that were all called Elohim. So all the societies of that time engaged in a number of worships of types of other gods. And particularly, I think one of the things that he's probably warning against here is, so you had, in a lot of those societies, you had a national god, you had a tribal god, or a family, a clan god, and then you had your personal household god. And we read about like the household idols that Laban had, right? So you as a nation might owe your allegiance to Baal or Dagon, but then typically in your household, your previous ancestors were assumed to have gone on and assumed the status of other Elohim that might watch over you particularly. Now this passage talks about the fact that there are other Elohim, but what it's saying is you shall not worship other Elohim, because no other Elohim are like me. God stands in a class all by himself. There are no other gods the way that I am. And there are lots of Old Testament passages as well as New Testament passages that talk about other Elohim. Psalm 82 is one, the way that Jesus quotes it in John chapter 10, verse 34. There are many Elohim, but only one rightly demands worship of man, and others are to be honored and regarded, even as is given in Jude chapter 8. So you'll recall in Jude verses 8 and 9, even in that passage, one of the accusations that's brought against the Christians there who are basically turned against the faith is that they wrongfully accuse, or they speak spitefully of the other Elohim. In other words, is what's said in Jude 8 and 9. Additionally, between the requirement you have here, this first requirement, and the words in chapter 19, verses 5 and 6, which were pretty important, you have potentially one of the first times in human history full-throated monotheism. All right, now we take this for granted, but perhaps nowhere else in the world at this point in time were there full, true monotheists anywhere. And God is calling them to a standard that basically did not exist on the earth at that point in time. He's saying, you shall only worship me. Nowhere else on the globe is that happening. And that would have been a major shock to this group of people. You'll recall the group of people that left were not just the Israelites, who probably did not just solely worship God, did not just solely worship Yahweh or the God of Jacob, the God of Isaac. They probably worshiped an abundance of other gods. And then there was also this other mixed multitude. And even when we get down to Joshua, as he gets to the end of his life, he talks about the gods that your fathers worshipped on the other side of the rivers. So it has likely never been that there's been real, true national monotheism until what God is calling them to do here, and it would have been an absolute shock. He is radically changing and educating the Israelites on what the nature of it means to be God. They assumed there couldn't possibly, the natural assumption, or the assumption that peoples had, is that there couldn't be one God out there who's controlling all these processes that are running around. They looked at the waters, they looked at the storm clouds, they looked at this land, the mountains, the valleys, and they said, well, surely there are individual Elohim that are running all these things. We can't imagine a God that's powerful enough, that has a mind that's intelligent enough to run all these things. And so everything must have had an independent God. But what he's revealing to them here is, you've sold the concept of God way short. You don't understand how overwhelmingly powerful, how overwhelmingly intelligent, how far above creation I am. And so he's giving them a crash course education in who he is in this first command. And I would also say, and then that's obviously the introduction of monotheism. In the second command, as I said, we're going to move pretty fast here tonight. So the second command reads like this in verses 4 through 6. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. And so specifically here, we have a prohibition on idolatry of all kinds. And we're going to spend a minute. I want to camp out on this command because it's a really big deal. So it prohibits idolatry of every and any kind. And there's some specific things in here that I want to call out that we might find a little weird. So you'll notice here in verse 4, he calls out 3 specific sections of creation: the skies above, the earth, the waters under the earth. These are references to the ancient Near Eastern cosmology, the way that they viewed the universe. They viewed the universe as a three-tiered thing. There was the skies, there was what's happening here, and that's what's underneath us. And you should make a God out of none of those things. In other words, God is saying, I'm not like any of those things. Additionally, notice the use of the word jealous in there. That's probably one of the first things that's also very striking in here, is he says, you should not bow to them because I am a jealous God, which is an interesting thing to say. And I've put up the Hebrew, you can see the Hebrew word there, jealous, and the stem of that word means deep red. All right, now think about this for me real quick. So, jealous, think about a husband who's found out his wife is cheating on him and what color the face turned. And that's literally where it came from. That's where this word comes from. The jealousy that a spouse has for their spouse who's been running around on them and the color they would turn in the face. That's the language, that's the stem of the word that's being used here. So God is saying, I am jealous for you in the way that a husband would be jealous for his wife. That is the nature of the relationship between Israel and God. And so that is, I think that colors the meaning, that's pun intended, that colors the meaning, obviously, of what he's trying to get across here. And I also think it's really interesting here what he's doing, and this further builds on the point that I was just making. The creature-creator divide is just an enormous, unbridgeable chasm. There is, what God is saying here is that I'm not like anything. And this was also an element that's very different than any of the other nations had about their gods. If you had to conceive of a God, okay, you don't know who God is, but you know the world around you. And so when we think about ancient pagan societies, what kind of gods did they come up with? Gods that were based on them. Think about, we're most familiar with the Greek gods. Think about the Greek gods. The Greek gods were lousy people. They were drunks, womanizers. They did all the sins that all the Greeks were doing. They were just like those people. And so to be able to conceive of a being that is wholly different than creation altogether, and that wasn't somehow intricately connected or one with the creation, a sort of pantheism that kind of underrode all of the polytheism that was going on in the world, this was another just huge crash course in how God really is completely different than anything you might have suspected he might be. He is wholly other. And the word that I've used here is triune holiness. When God is described, when God appears, there's always beings, there are other Elohim that are there, and they're saying, holy, holy, holy. And why are they saying that? Because he is triune different than anything you know. Even the beings, even when you've got passages like Isaiah 6, where you basically have heavenly dragons, the burning ones, the seraphs, with 6 wings flying around, and they're saying, those beings are not like anything we know, but those beings are saying, this God is unlike anything else. He is holy, holy, holy. He's in a completely different kind of class than anything else that there is. And so, idolatry in the Old Testament and in that culture, the way it worked, and I also think this is important to know for determining why this is so difficult, why this ends up being an issue. What they would do when the household would create a new idol, they would fashion an idol, and they would perform a ceremony that was supposed to invoke a piece of the God that they were calling upon and put it in that idol. All right, so they wanted to put an essence of the God in that idol and capture that essence there, so the God was always available in the house for prayers, for worship, and was there in their tent. And these gods, again, were synonymous with every aspect of creation. But the thing about the gods that they created is that they demanded very little of the people that they actually ruled. They demanded very little in the way of the way that you ought to behave, the ethics that you ought to have. And they were very convenient. And in fact, most of those gods, given all the assumptions that I've given you, Dagon didn't demand monotheism. Baal didn't demand monotheism. In fact, those gods started with the assumption that you were going to worship other gods as well. What he's calling them to here is that radically different. We have to change the underlying assumptions upon which all God worship has been done in every other nation. Totally different. And so what you see, and what's interesting about all this is in the passage, what's alluded to here is the multi-generational way that idolatry affects people. And one of the ways that that's rendered is in Psalms chapter 15, the 115th Psalm, where it says, "Why should the Gentiles say, 'So where is their God?'" So the Gentiles say, we can't see, obviously this is one of the main problems that Israelites always had. Where is their God? But our God is in heaven. He does whatever he pleases. Their idols are silver and gold, the work of men's hands. They have mouths, but they don't speak. Eyes they have, but they do not see. They have ears, but they do not hear. Noses they have, but they don't smell. They have hands, but they do not handle. Feet they have, but they do not walk, nor do they mutter their throat. And here's the key verse. Those who make them are like them. So is everyone who trusts them. You become like the God you worship is an underlying principle throughout the Bible. If this is the kind of God that you bow down to, you become like the thing you worship. And that's true on the flip side with us in worshiping Christ. Beholding God is becoming Christ. Bowing to idols is becoming like those deaf, dumb, ineffectual idols. Greeks envisioned gods who were womanizers and drunks because they themselves were womanizers and drunks. And when they bowed down to womanizers and drunks, guess what they became more of? Womanizers and drunks. You become like the thing you worship. And he's calling them here to a completely different kind of standard. Furthermore, and this is one of the things that I just love, that we're not going to take time to read this. But in Deuteronomy chapter 4, when Moses is retelling these events to the second generation of Israelites, the thing that he emphasizes over and over again is he says, when you came to the mountain, you saw no form. All you experienced was the power. Therefore, be careful. Don't think I'm like any of these other things. And he repeats the three-tiered cosmology of the Israelites. I'm not like any of those things, but you saw no form. And so there was nothing. The idols are convenient because you can sum up everything you want to know about this God in this thing I can set right here and I can put them in my tent. What God is saying here, what Yahweh is saying here, I'm not a convenient God. I'm not one that you can set down in your tent and just have available for you whenever you want. And you can't think of something that's going to summarize me. There's no thing that's going to summarize me. And it leads me to this quote from Tozer that Lawrence has read. What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. What we think God is like is one of the most determining attributes of ourselves, because you become like what you worship. And so whatever you've got fixed in your mind as who God is, that is the thing that you desire the most and the thing that you will be driving towards. And so this passage speaks to the nature of the way that idolatry is a generational sin. It infects the first generation, the second generation, the third generation, because you're driving towards something that's driving you either further away or closer to what God really is. And what God is looking for in this command is he's looking to show covenant loyalty. He's looking to show covenant faithfulness to those who are covenantally faithful to him. And that that is the very basis upon which that's why many of us are here today. Many of us have had parents and grandparents who have been, and great-grandparents who have been covenantally faithful. And that benefit continues on and on and on. And that was the benefit that Israel was supposed to receive, that they were supposed to be in a covenant relationship with God. But we know of any sin that stuck them so badly, it was this one. And this sin, they couldn't ditch. And it was a major turning point. I mean, of all the sins, this was the one. They just didn't get who God was and how he was so radically different than anything else that they saw around them. They couldn't get over it. They couldn't adjust to the education that God was trying to give them in these first and second commands. I wanted to spend additional time on that because I think we think idolatry is stupid in some ways, but you have to understand the world in which they live, and you also have to take appreciation, obviously, of the world in which we live, where our idolatry, we think we're so sophisticated, but we're really not. Because while we don't make these idols anymore out of these things, we actually make them much smaller and much more technologically advanced now. This is really nice and convenient, has all the information in the world right on it, but this is a whole lot of people's gods. I know that because we can't stop beholding it, and so we're becoming it. That's a freebie. That didn't cost you anything. All right, command number 3. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. So this command, I'll just tell you right off the bat, is very broad, and it really all surrounds on what you think the word nasa means. This word is rendered a lot in the Old Testament as to lift or to bear up. So read it again, but instead of pre-programming in there the word, you're thinking, take the name of the Lord in vain. You're thinking about speech. Now let me read it with this. You shall not bear the name of the Lord your God in vain, for Lord God will not hold him guiltless who bears his name in vain. When I say that, it broadens the scope of this a lot. When we talk about bearing someone's name, when you have someone's name upon you, now suddenly not just the speech is involved, although the speech is involved. That's still a component part of this. But now we're also talking about bearing his name, and this literally came into import because many Israelites had Yahweh-based names. They literally bore the name of God. Elijah, Jeremiah, Isaiah, all of those have a root stem from Yahweh. These men literally bore the name of Yahweh, as did many other. We have a lot of El-based names. Daniel, all right? Those also reflect God and his name. And so the idea, of course, is that, and it's so very broad in that all that you do, your speech, all of it, none of it should be in vain. None of it should reflect poorly upon Yahweh, and that would include your speech, that would include your actions. But again, this is one of the main things that the Israelites failed at. Because when we come around to the New Testament and we get to the book of Romans, and Paul's talking there and he's like, my name is blasphemed amongst the Gentiles because of you Israelites. Because the way you've acted for all these years, my name is blasphemed amongst the nations. And so all are confined under sin. But the command here, and I think obviously speech is a big component of it. We know that James obviously makes reference to how controlling the tongue is one of the most difficult tasks that man has. You know, the tongue, who can tame it? But it also comprises everything that we are to bear up underneath, we are to take the name, bear up under the name. Those who are called by the name of God have the responsibility to not bear it in vain, to not take it, to not bear it, to not lift it up in vain. And those of us, obviously, who have taken the name of Christ, bear the responsibility to not hold that name in derision. And we hold that name in derision by obviously not living up to the fact that we have taken upon his name. It's the same kind of idea extended here to the Israelites. Okay, command number 4. This is the longest command that there is. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. This is interesting because this is one of the commands that's not obvious. This is one of the revelatory commands of God, and he gives you all the why as to why we're doing this. And I think Scott had said something a class period ago or a couple class periods ago about imagine being a slave for hundreds of years and in your constitution is, and you're going to take a break now. And how absolutely crazy that must have been to those folks. I can't imagine at this point not having a day off a week. That would just be draining to me. But these people lived in a world in which that was not commonplace. And so what he's saying here is that there is a holy rest that God provides. You're to take a rest. You're to keep it holy, keep it sacred, set apart from all the other days. And not just you, but all your servants, the strangers who are in your land, even your animals are not allowed to work on this day. You are to the extent possible. Is that my fault? No. All right. To the extent possible, you are to take a rest that God is providing for you. And it's pointing towards the fact that God is the giver of rest, that God is providing, that God is interested in your well-being. Think about what this command is presupposing. This command is telegraphing to the Israelites, I am your God. Not only am I interested in what I can get out of you, I want to give you something. I want to provide you rest. And it points towards it points to the entire direction of Scripture. God wants to return to a rest for his people. And we even see this in the book of Hebrews, where we keep pushing forward to Hebrews chapter 4, where there is a rest that God's going to provide. There's going to be this rest. And he's doing this at the creation of Israel as a nation. Now that's interesting when you get around to the Deuteronomy version of this command, because in the Deuteronomy version of this command, the rationale for the Sabbath completely changes. He ditches the creation and instead talks about their creation as a nation. So the language completely changes if you go and read the Deuteronomy version versus the Exodus version. And I think it points to the fact that God is once again creating something. He's creating something new in the Deuteronomy. So they're entering the land. He's creating that kingdom there. He's making it equivalent to when he created the world, a similar creation by creating these two accounts. And the other thing is that he's saying that this is built, this rest that I'm telling you have to take, it's built into the very fabric of creation. The very nature of the world is built upon work to be done, then rest to be had. Work to be done, rest to be had. It was there at the beginning. It's built into the very sequence and cycles upon which the world operates. Every 7 days, you have a Sabbath. Every 7th month, you have the ultimate festival of the year. You have a 2-week break to celebrate being with God. Every 7th set of 7 years, you have a Jubilee year, which you do nothing. And you let the land fallow, and you let the slaves go free, and you forgive the debts, and it's the ultimate rest. In these cycles of sevens, built into the very fabric of creation, God is pointing to work, and he's pointing to rest, and he's saying it's for the good of mankind. That man was made for the Sabbath, not the Sabbath for man, and that to the extent possible, you are to rest and you are to remember that I am the Lord your God who gives you a rest. And that facilitates thousands of years from now, the Hebrew writer saying, those people died in the wilderness. There's still a rest out here for all of us who will continue to be obedient and press forward into it. And so we obviously here today would say there's still a rest that's awaiting each and every one. It's ultimately a rest for each and every one of us to enter into and to benefit from the labors of our works in our relationship with God on an eternal basis. It's built into the very fabric of this entire universe. Command number 5. Command number 5 is honor your father and mother. Honor your father and mother. It's a protection for the good of the Israelite society. It looks forward, and it says, particularly with the promise, it says that your days may be long upon the land. So obviously, for the good of society, you hope to live a long time. Your parents have lived a long time. Maybe your grandparents have lived a long time. Maybe your great-grandparents have lived a long time. And so someone should take care of them, and that you hope also that you will live a long time. And so again, we've got to remember that these are the constitutional, this isn't just the religious law. This is also the societal law. This is how society doesn't break down. You care for your elders. Guess what? We've got that problem today. This is how society doesn't break down. You care for your elders. God is telling them in the law here, this is how we make sure that things continue to go smoothly, is that you must care for your elders. If you hope to one day be an elder yourself, you should care for your elders. Otherwise, everything kind of obviously goes to pot. And then obviously it looks forward into the dwelling of the land. Command number 6, briefly, I also want to get to, you shall not murder. Command number 7, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on some of these. Command number 7, I do want to spend just a little bit of time on. Command number 7 is the prohibition against adultery. So adultery in the ancient Near East was known as the great sin. There is a number of texts from Ugaritic and Egyptian that support the idea that adultery was considered the great sin. And particularly emphasized here is the sexual relationship or violation of the sexual covenant inside of marriage. And there's a reason for that. Now, obviously, all sexual activity outside of the covenant relationship of marriage is against the Hebrew law, but particularly in this document, it's talking about within the marriage, and there's a reason for that. So it particularly relates the idea of adultery and idolatry. Idolatry and adultery are frequently related, both in physical practice and in spiritual consequence throughout the entirety of the Old Testament. God frequently refers to Israel running around on him as his covenant husband through their idolatry as adultery. I've done really good in saying that thus far. I'm going to slip up here in a minute. But there's an equivalency between those two things. And it also appears that once we get over to the New Testament, and Paul goes from place to place in the Gentile churches, one of the things that he has to tell everybody repeatedly is warnings against sexual impropriety. It's one of the ways, it's one of the mainstays, it's one of the things that defines your relationship with Christ. That we have stable homes with sexual propriety is a defining marker of both the Israelite covenant and our relationship with Christ. Why? Because it's so different and so different from the rest of the world and so fundamental to the structure of the society. God is giving this rule for a very good reason. It's because societies don't function when families and homes break down. He's telling them this because if you have men running around on wives and homes breaking down, societies stop to function. But that's not the only thing he's telling us, and we don't come to realize this until much later, is that all of this portrays the much larger relationship between Christ and the church, and ultimately between God and Israel, right? All of this is a picture, is supposed to show the fundamentals of the nature of the relationship between God and his people. Remember when I said idolatry, God is a jealous God. He turns beet red at the idolatry and the adultery of his people, is also summed up and backed into this command because God cares for the family, he cares for the children, and he cares for those married women who in that day and age could not provide for themselves the way they could with a man. And so all of this was for their good and their well-being. In command number 8, we have a prohibition against stealing. Command number 9 against false witness, and command number 10 against covetousness. Now I want to say a couple things about these real quick because they have some import into our current society today. So I want you to notice in these, especially in 8 and 10, it presupposes in these commands property rights. Now, y'all think that the Bible has something to say about everything, really, if you're looking for it. God actually has opinions on economics, believe it or not. God has some opinions on economics. And one of the things that it presupposes is that God has given the right for you to own things and for me to not own those things. God is a supporter of property rights. And from some Christian circles today, there is opposition to property rights. But the 10 commandments in and of themselves presuppose property rights. And we have reached such a state of enrichment that we believe that property rights are somehow antithetical to charity or to fairness or some other thing on that. But the exact opposite is true. God has given you what he's given you because he has deemed that that is what is good for you. And that we should not steal from one another. I have no right to come take what belongs to you because God has given it to you and not to me, and that is yours and it is not mine. When we remove all aspect of property rights that God has given, we are endorsing stealing, we're endorsing slavery. We are endorsing a dependency upon the state that God says overtly that he is against. And in command number 9, that was a freebie also as well. Command number 9 is against false witness. Again, God is looking out for the best interests in the functioning of that society. All these sins relate directly to the impact on Israelite society. A society has to have truthful witnesses in court. If you can't have truthful witnesses in court, obviously it impugns your ability to have a justice that can adjudicate cases well. And in number 10, some scholars, number 10 is the warning against covetousness. And particularly here, covetousness means simply desire. And it doesn't say you shall not desire. Instead, the prohibition here, desire becomes a sin based on its object. And in this case, the warning here is against desiring the wrong things. It's okay to desire. Even God is desirous of his people. But what you desire determines the direction you'll go. And many scholars have rationalized that the 10th is not just one thrown there at the end, that it's actually the capstone of all the other commands, that they're all somehow encompassed in this one. And I kind of buy it, kind of sort of. They rationalize in this by saying what a man wants, what a person actually really desires, rules them in some way. And if you desire the right kind of things, if I am desirous of my wife, if I am desirous of my relationship with God, if I am desirous of my children and their well-being, and I put those things in the proper order, all the other commands are going to fall in place. Literally all of them. If I desire what God desires towards him and towards my fellow man, as we saw previously, where all the commandments hang on those two things, everything else is going to fall into place. And so your desires must be based and directed towards the things that God would have them be directed towards. Now, finally, we're at the end of this, at the end of the 10 Commandments, we have these verses in 18 through 21. Now all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning, the flashes, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood afar off. Then they said to Moses, "You speak with us, and we will hear. But let not God speak with, lest we die." And Moses said to the people, "Do not fear, for God has come to test you, and that his fear may be before you, so that you may not sin." So the people stood afar off, but Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. So in this particular passage, we just see the awesome and unbelievable power and the sound that is there. And the sense is that this unholy people, that this sinful people feels like if they get too close, they will literally die. That the voice of God will literally reach out and kill them. I was at a zoo one time and I heard a lion roar. I looked this up before class. Lion roar is 114 decibels. It's the loudest roar. It's the loudest of anything on earth. I was at a zoo when I heard a lion roar one time and I freaked out. I cannot imagine what they heard to think they would die. But in this particular relationship, they call for Moses to be a mediator between them and God. And notice in Exodus chapter 20, there's two uses of fear. He says, don't fear, and his fear should be before you so that you may not sin. It's important to remember, children of Israel, it's important to remember this photo here today. Take a picture of what's going on here today and have it ever keep before you, because if you do, it will keep you from sin. But Moses somehow was unaffected by God's grace in this, and he becomes a mediator for the people, much like future lawgiver Christ. And there are 1,000,001 ways that we could obviously tout those two things together. But from there, Jay's going to pick up and talk about the rest of the law from there. Thank you guys very much.